December 16, 1944, 5:30 in the morning, the Ardennes forest, Belgium. The world is still dark, and the forest is silent. Then the guns open up. 1,600 German artillery pieces unleash a coordinated barrage along an 80-mile stretch of the Allied front line. For 90 minutes, the frozen earth shakes. American soldiers in foxholes grip their helmets, press their faces into the mud, and pray. And then through the snow, through the mist, through the pre-dawn dark come the tanks. 200,000 German soldiers, nearly 1,000 tanks, and 3 full armies smash into the weakest section of the Allied line in one of the most audacious surprise attacks of World War II. Adolf Hitler has thrown everything he has left into this gamble, a desperate attempt to split the British and American armies in two, recapture the Belgian port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to sue for peace. The attack has a code name, Operation Rhine, Watch on the Rhine. The Americans will call it something else, the Battle of the Bulge. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button right now. We cover the battles, the rivalries, and the real decisions that shaped World War II. New video every day. Don't miss the next one. And out of this crisis, one of the most dangerous moments the Allied cause would face since D-Day, would come one of the most bitter command controversies of the entire war. A controversy that would pit two of the most famous generals on the Allied side against each other in a confrontation that still echoes through military history. On one side, General George S. Patton, the flamboyant, foul-mouthed, utterly brilliant American commander of the Third Army. On the other, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, the methodical, meticulous, and maddeningly self-congratulatory British commander of the 21st Army Group. What happened between these two men after the Battle of the Bulge, and what Patton said, is a story about pride, credit, truth, and the ugly politics of coalition warfare. December 19, 1944, a cold stone building in Verdun, France. 3 days into the German offensive, the situation is catastrophic. German spearheads have driven 50 miles into American lines. The town of Bastogne, a critical crossroads in Belgium, is surrounded. Entire divisions have been chewed up. More than 7,000 men from the 106th Infantry Division have been forced to surrender. Battle Group Paper, a ferocious SS armored unit led by the ruthless Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper, is knifing westward toward the Meuse River. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower has called his senior generals to an emergency meeting in Verdun, France. He travels there in an armored Cadillac, flanked by guards, because the threat of German saboteurs in American uniforms, part of a covert operation called Operation Grafe, is very real. The mood in the room is bleak. Every commander present knows that this is the largest German counterattack since the Normandy invasion, and it came with almost total surprise. Eisenhower looks around the table and says something that will be remembered. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. Then he turns to Patton. Patton is ready. In fact, and this is the part that will stagger everyone in the room, Patton has already started. Before he even left his headquarters in Nancy, France that morning, Patton had quietly ordered his chief of staff to begin pivoting the Third Army northward. He had identified 3 possible scenarios, codenamed them in advance, and assigned his corps commanders to prepare for each. All Patton needed was the phone call, and the giant machine would begin to move. When Eisenhower asks how quickly Patton can disengage from his current campaign in the Saar region, turn his entire army 90 degrees, and attack north into the southern flank of the German Bulge, there is a ripple of skepticism in the room. Patton lights a cigar, points to the bulge on the battle map and says, "Brad, the Kraut stuck his head in a meat grinder." He closes his fist, "And this time I've got hold of the handle." Then he tells Eisenhower he he can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room goes silent. 48 hours. To turn an entire army with all its armor, artillery, supply lines, and personnel through brutal winter conditions, over icy roads, across a completely different axis of attack. It is, by any standard of military logistics, virtually impossible. Patton's aide, Lieutenant Colonel Charles R. Codman, later wrote that there was a stir, a shuffling of feet as those present straightened up in their chairs. In some faces, skepticism showed, but through the room a current of excitement leaped. Eisenhower, cautious as always, tells Patton to use 3 days, not 2, to make sure he doesn't attack piecemeal. Patton agrees, but the machinery is already in motion. December 22-26, 1944, southern Belgium and Luxembourg. What Patton accomplished in those days is considered one of the greatest logistical feats in military history. He moved 3 full divisions, the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry, northward through one of the worst winters Europe had seen in decades. The roads were icy. The forests were dense. The supply lines had to be completely rebuilt on the fly, and at the other end of the drive, the Germans were waiting. As Patton would later write in his diary, moving 3 divisions in winter from one battlefield to another over crowded roads with a 90-degree change in direction of attack is one of the most difficult operations of war. He pulled it off anyway. By December 22, elements of the 4th Armored Division were fighting within 6 miles of Bastogne, where the surrounded 101st Airborne Division under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had famously replied to a German surrender demand with a single word: nuts. On December 26, 1944, the 4th Armored broke through. The siege of Bastogne was lifted. The southern shoulder of the Bulge was stabilized. The momentum of the German offensive, already faltering due to fuel shortages and fierce American resistance at Elsenborn Ridge in the north, began to collapse. Up in the north, meanwhile, things had gotten complicated. On December 20, Eisenhower made a controversial but operationally sound decision. He temporarily transferred command of all American forces north of the Bulge, including the U.S. First Army under General Courtney Hodges and the U.S. Ninth Army under General William Simpson, to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. The reasoning was practical. The German assault had disrupted General Omar Bradley's communications with his northern armies. Montgomery, positioned to the north, had intact communications and fresh reserves. Eisenhower needed someone who could stabilize the northern shoulder and coordinate a counterattack. But the decision wounded American pride deeply. Bradley was furious. Patton was dismissive. And American soldiers, who had bled and died to hold the northern shoulder at places like Elsenborn Ridge, would soon have reason to feel their sacrifice was being minimized. December 20, 1944, January 3, 1945, the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Montgomery did, by most fair historical accounts, contribute to stabilizing the northern front. He moved the British 30 Corps to reserve positions behind the Meuse River as a failsafe. He repositioned American units, tightened the defensive line, and prevented what might have become a catastrophic collapse. But Montgomery was slow. He was methodical to the point of frustration. While Patton was charging north with everything he had, Montgomery was carefully consolidating, waiting, planning. Patton, watching from the south, was seething. He had been pushing for a bold plan, a massive encirclement that would cut off the entire German salient at its base and bag every German soldier inside the Bulge. Montgomery blocked it. Eisenhower declined it. In Patton's own diary, he wrote of Montgomery being very timid and said that had it not been for Montgomery's excessive caution, the Americans could have bagged the whole German army. The contrast between the two commanders could not have been starker. Patton was attacking, slashing, pushing forward through ice and darkness. Montgomery was methodically repositioning, studying, waiting for the perfect moment. Montgomery only ordered his forces to begin their main counterattack on January 3, 1945, more than 2 weeks after the German offensive began, and more than a week after Patton had already relieved Bastogne. Even when he did attack, the British contribution to the northern shoulder numbered far fewer troops than the Americans fighting under his command. Out of the roughly 600,000 Allied troops involved in the Battle of the Bulge, the British contribution was approximately 55,000 men, fewer than 1/10 of the total force. That number matters because of what happened next. January 7, 1945, Montgomery's headquarters, Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge is not yet over, but the outcome is no longer in doubt. The German tide has crested. The Bulge is being compressed from both north and south. German forces are retreating. It is in this atmosphere, with American blood still fresh in the Ardennes snow, that Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery calls a press conference at his headquarters in Belgium on January 7, 1945. He speaks for approximately 1 hour, without notes. On the surface, parts of the speech are gracious. He praises Eisenhower. He praises the American soldier. He talks about teamwork. But the overall impression he leaves, confirmed by journalists present, by historians, and eventually by Montgomery himself, is unmistakable. That he, Montgomery, arrived to take command of a crumbling situation, that he organized and directed the response, and that the battle was saved largely through his intervention. He tells the press, "As soon as I saw what was happening, I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over the river." He describes the campaign almost as if he had been the conductor of the entire Allied orchestra. The impression left, as historian Alex Kershaw later wrote in his book The Longest Winter, was of massive American blundering. Only when he had been brought in to command the armies holding the northern shoulder had catastrophe been averted. American commanders who read the press dispatches and heard the reports were enraged. General Omar Bradley, who had endured the humiliation of having his own armies temporarily transferred to a British field marshal, was furious. He fired off protests to Eisenhower. But no American general was more publicly, more bluntly, more viciously angry than George S. Patton. Patton had despised Montgomery for years. Their rivalry stretched back through North Africa and Sicily, where they had clashed over operational priorities, supply allocations, and credit for victories. Patton believed, with considerable justification, that Montgomery's demands for supplies in late 1944 had directly halted his own advance through France, costing weeks of momentum and perhaps shortening the war if he had been allowed to push through. Now, after Patton had performed what many military historians consider the greatest tactical pivot in American military history, after his army had broken the siege of Bastogne and saved the southern shoulder of the Bulge, after all of that, Montgomery was standing before the world's press, suggesting he had saved the day. Patton's response was characteristically unfiltered. He said that, had it not been for Montgomery's excessive caution in the north, the Americans could have bagged the whole German army in the Ardennes. He called it a missed opportunity of enormous proportions. He was equally blunt about what he saw as Montgomery's fundamental character flaw as a battlefield commander. War requires the taking of risks, and he won't take them. In his diary, Patton was even less diplomatic about Montgomery's conduct throughout the entire Ardennes campaign. He wrote with barely concealed fury about Montgomery's slowness, his self-promotion, and what Patton viewed as his near-criminal timidity in not launching an aggressive northern counterattack sooner, when the opportunity existed to destroy the German forces while they were still extended and vulnerable. Patton also noted, with bitter irony, that the whole crisis might never have grown as dangerous as it did had proper forces been positioned in the Ardennes beforehand, and that Montgomery had actually warned Eisenhower about the gap in the American lines as far back as November 28, 1944, while the generals who ignored that warning were now quietly accepting reduced scrutiny because Montgomery had conveniently made himself the story. In the days and weeks following the press conference, Patton's contempt for Montgomery, already legendary, hardened into something permanent and unforgiving. To understand the depth of Patton's anger, you have to understand what the Battle of the Bulge actually cost American soldiers. More than 19,000 Americans were killed in the Battle of the Bulge. Total American casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing, exceeded 70,000 men. It was the bloodiest battle the United States Army fought in World War II. The men who held Elsenborn Ridge in the north, soldiers of the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions, outnumbered and freezing, held the critical northern shoulder against wave after wave of German assault before Montgomery ever formally took command of the sector. The 101st Airborne surrounded at Bastogne, surviving on reduced rations, dwindling ammunition, and sheer will, they held for days without Patton, without Montgomery, without any relief at all. And it was American trucks, American tanks, American engineers blowing bridges in the path of German armored columns, and ultimately American blood that broke the spine of the German offensive. For Montgomery to stand before the press and imply that he had orchestrated the rescue of all this felt, to Patton and to Bradley, and to thousands of American soldiers who would read about it, like a theft of honor. January 7, 1945. The political fallout was immediate and severe. General Omar Bradley, who was already wounded by the command transfer, launched what one historian described as a broadside against Montgomery, telling Eisenhower in no uncertain terms that something had to be done. Bradley felt that before Montgomery's press conference, he himself had held briefings that left the press with the impression that he had been running operations across the entire front, and that Monty's performance had upstaged and undercut him in a deeply personal way. Eisenhower passed the complaints up the chain to Prime Minister Winston Churchill. On January 18, 1945, Churchill addressed the House of Commons and delivered a pointed, deliberate rebuke of the impression Montgomery had created. His words were chosen with surgical precision. Care must be taken in telling our proud tale not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. It was a remarkable statement. The British Prime Minister, in open Parliament, was essentially telling his most celebrated field commander to stop stealing credit from the Americans. The effect was significant. Combined with the fury of Bradley and the contempt of Patton, and the quiet but firm displeasure of Eisenhower himself, Montgomery found himself facing near-total isolation among the senior Allied command. Montgomery was almost removed from his command. His position became genuinely precarious. He had supporters in the British press and among certain British politicians, but the American generals, who controlled the overwhelming majority of men and material in the Western Allied effort, were done with him. Eventually, Montgomery himself acknowledged that the press conference had been a disaster. He later said, "Distorted or not, I think now that I should never have held that press conference. So great were the feelings against me on the part of the American generals that whatever I said was bound to be wrong. I should therefore have said nothing." Eisenhower echoed this in his own memoirs, writing, "I doubt if Montgomery ever came to realize how resentful some American commanders were. They believed he had belittled them, and they were not slow to voice reciprocal scorn and contempt." So who was right? The historical record, examined with some distance, is nuanced, but its essential verdict is not really in doubt. Montgomery's contribution to the Battle of the Bulge was real but limited. He stabilized the northern shoulder. He moved reserves intelligently. He prevented what might have been a catastrophic gap near the Meuse River. These things are true. But the overwhelming burden of the fighting, the dying, and the decisive counterattack fell on American shoulders. It was American soldiers at Elsenborn Ridge who stopped the powerful German 6th Panzer Army cold in the north, before Montgomery had done anything. It was the 101st Airborne at Bastogne who refused to break under siege. It was Patton and the 3rd Army who performed the logistical miracle of the pivot and smashed through to relieve Bastogne. It was American air power. Once the weather cleared on December 26, that tore apart German supply lines and armored columns. British forces constituted less than 1/10 of the Allied strength in the battle. Yet Montgomery's press conference left much of the world with the impression that British generalship had rescued American incompetence. That was not history, that was mythology, and the Americans who had fought and bled in the Ardennes knew it. Patton, never subtle and never wrong about the essential military facts, understood this completely. His fury was not merely personal ego, though he certainly had plenty of that. His fury was the fury of a commander who had watched his soldiers perform the extraordinary, who had demanded the impossible from them and watched them deliver it, only to see the credit drifted northward like smoke in the wind. There is another dimension to this story that history sometimes loses. Patton and Montgomery had been clashing since North Africa in 1942 and 1943. They had competed in Sicily. They had argued throughout the drive across France. Patton had watched, enraged, as Montgomery's supply demands repeatedly drained fuel and resources from the American armies in the fall of 1944, halting what Patton believed could have been a war-ending drive into Germany. In Patton's view, Montgomery was not merely an annoying rival. He was a strategic liability, a commander whose excessive caution, constant demands, and relentless self-promotion had cost the Allies months of time and thousands of lives. The press conference in January 1945 was not a single incident. It was the culmination of years of friction. And Patton said so, loudly, repeatedly. In his diary, in his conversations with Bradley and other officers, in remarks that were only imperfectly suppressed by the political necessities of coalition warfare. He told anyone who would listen that Montgomery had failed to take risks when risks needed to be taken, that the entire northern shoulder of the Bulge could have been transformed into a catastrophic German defeat, men and machines trapped in the snow, if Montgomery had attacked with the same aggression that Patton had brought from the south. Instead, Montgomery waited, and the Germans escaped. Then, having escaped, they read their defeat in the newspapers as a British victory. January 25, 1945. The Battle of the Bulge officially ends. On January 25, 1945, the last German troops withdrew from the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was over. Hitler's great gamble had failed. Germany had lost an irreplaceable 100,000 men as casualties, with another 100,000 captured. More than 800 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned. The material cost to Germany was so severe that, when the Soviets launched their own massive offensive on the Eastern Front just days later, the Wehrmacht had almost nothing left to stop them. The Western Allies had paid dearly too, but they had held, and then they had won. The men who made that victory happen, the frozen soldiers at Elsenborn Ridge, the surrounded paratroopers at Bastogne, the tankers of Patton's 4th Armored crashing through to relieve them, those men knew what they had done. Their families back home knew. Their commanders knew. And George Patton, flawed and brilliant and impossible and irreplaceable, made sure that history knew too. He did not stay quiet when quiet was politically convenient. He did not accept a version of events that he believed was wrong. He said what he saw, with the same bluntness and force that he brought to every battlefield he ever fought on. Whether you agreed with Patton's assessment of Montgomery or not, and honest historians have since pointed out that the full picture of the battle is more complicated than either man's version. One thing is beyond dispute. The Battle of the Bulge, as Winston Churchill himself declared before the whole of the British Parliament, was the greatest American battle of the war. An American victory, won in the snow. If you found this story compelling, like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Do you think Montgomery deserved more credit than he got, or was Patton right to call it out the way he did? History is more complicated than headlines, and so was this battle.